Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Une grande bienvenue à tous les étudiants qui sont ici pour participer.
Welcome to all students who are here to take part in this debate on human rights. I'd like to acknowledge the presence of the Ambassador of Chile to Canada, Alejandro Maria Corret, and the presence of Randy Boissonnault, Special Advisor for the Prime Minister for the LGBTQ2 issues.
Human rights. I would like to start by acknowledging that we are on the territory of the Algonquin Nation. Canada has learned a lot in our engagement with First Nations, and we have a lot yet to learn. So I think it's particularly poignant that for a discussion with two such senior people in the international struggle for human rights that we are doing so on Algonquin land and recognizing it as such. Now, I would like to start with an introduction of our two speakers, and then I'll turn the floor to them. Let me start with our guest, Madame Bachelet. She is the UN Commissioner for Human Rights and comes with a tremendous credibility to that job. In her 2 terms as President of Chile, she created a National Institute for Human Rights. She brought far-reaching reforms to access to education, and she oversaw the passage of a law to grant rights for civil partnerships for same-sex couples. In between her 2 terms, she was the very first executive director of UN Women, but she also knows what it's like to be on the other side of the human rights debate. As a young woman in the early days of the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet, she was a prisoner of conscience, and her family suffered terribly from that regime. One of the things that I think really struck me most about her background was when 30 years later she became the Minister of Defense and managed to broker an extraordinary reconciliation between the armed forces of her country and the citizens that they had repressed, and secured a commitment that never again would they be used to prevent or to stand in the way of democracy in her country. So it's a real honor to have Michelle Bachelet. Que sea la bienvenida a nuestro país, señora alta comisionada. Por favor.
Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon to everyone. Unfortunately, mon français n'est pas bon, so I will speak in English.
Unfortunately, my French is not very good.
Parle comme un enfant. So, and it's not supposed to.
I speak like a child.
But the thing is that we're very happy to have you be here with Minister Freeland to talk about human rights in the world and the situation on multilateralism, human rights, and the kinds of discussions that are here today. We are living in a very complex time, and we have seen the pushback on, the intense eroding multilateralism and the pushback on human rights. That's why in the office we said, let's push back the pushback, because we need human rights to continue being important. Some people could ask themselves, are human rights important today in the world? Yes, they are. They've always been. Human rights is not it's not a Western contraction like some countries have said. It was a universal rights. I believe everyone wants to be ensured that they have the different rights that the Universal Declaration enshrines. And it's interesting, because we have young people here, young generation, we're waiting for young generation to also pick the flags of the human rights and continue going forward. That when the commissioners were established to write the draft of the Human Rights Universal Declaration, there were people there from many parts of the world. So there were Latin Americans, there were Asians, Indians, of course Europeans, and probably for Americans as well. And I don't know if there was a Canadian commissioner, but maybe. But the thing is that it's interesting because the Universal Declaration of Human Rights speaks of all human beings. At that time, the word was les droits de l'homme. So that was how it was going to be written, men's rights. And there was an Indian woman, a feminist, that just said, if you put that, it will be used against the right of the women. So let's talk about all human beings. So that's the main sense of the Universal Declaration. And even though we are far away from what happened 70 years ago, that after the Second World War, people were so impressed and horrified with what was happening. We said, which are the kind of main rights that we have to have as a dream to live, that we can all live together and respect and ensure and promote and protect. And those are the ones who are reflected in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And of course, as an office, we are working in many different areas. Of course, political and civil space, political and civil rights, but also social, economic, and cultural rights. But we're also going into other new areas, like, of course, the Agenda 2030 with the Sustainable Development Goals and how we can add value to it. But also, of course, and probably we're going to speak a little bit later about that, environmental rights, because I believe climate change is a big threat for humanity. And also technology and human rights, because we see that has huge possibilities for well-being of the humanity, but on the other hand, it has big threats, and we can speak a little bit later about it. So happy to be here and to have this possibility with the minister. Oh, of course, I forgot something that I would never forget. Gender rights, of course, gender equality and women's rights. So it's about everything, and of course LGBTI community rights and so on. So we're working business and human rights. We're working in many different areas to ensure that the people's life will be better and will be improved. And I want to end here thanking Canada. Thanking Canada, thanking you, Minister, because you have a foreign policy that is really strong, not only on gender, but also on human rights. You have been championing human rights all over the world, and in the world that is today, we really need voices like Canadian voices. So thank you very much for that.
Well, thank you, and I can't miss the opportunity as a Canadian to tout our role in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The very first draft was written by a Canadian, John Humphrey. We're very proud of that here in Canada. Let me now introduce Minister Freeland. As the High Commissioner has mentioned, she is one of the strongest and most respected voices in defense of human rights in the world. She got her start, professional start, as a foreign correspondent in the Ukraine and in Russia, documenting the shifting fortunes of those two countries between authoritarianism and democracy, and then, of course, became a champion for issues of economic equality in our own countries. Since becoming Foreign Minister, she has led the charge and become a very strong voice in the defense of many difficult human rights situations in the world, from the situation of the Rohingya in Myanmar to what's happening in China. And I can tell you, when I was ambassador in Venezuela, having her as one of the very first senior world leaders to come out and talk publicly about the abuses of human rights and the backsliding in democracy made her a household name in Venezuela. So we're very lucky to have her here today to tell us about Canada's perspective in the defense of human rights.
Okay, merci Ben. Et comme toi déjà.
Thank you, Ben. So, as you've done, I also would like to emphasize the fact that we're on the traditional territory of the Algonquin. I'm very happy to be with you today, and thank you, Madame Bachelet, to be with you.
Which is, we were very, very lucky to have him do so many important jobs for Canada as a diplomat. And most recently, as he pointed out, he was a big part of our getting more focused on Venezuela. And it is great to have someone with so much real-world experience of the hard work of diplomacy, now leading one of Canada's premier civil society organizations that works on this. So thank you very much. High Commissioner, it is, High Representative, it is so good to see you here. We were always delighted when Michelle came to Canada. Remember that great conversation and meeting we had with the Prime Minister as President of Chile? And we're very delighted to have you here in this role. And I do want to say I'm really pleased that Ben, in his introduction, spoke about your personal biography. I have always found it really inspiring. And I have always felt, both in conversations we have with you and work we do together, but also just in watching your work in the world, that personal life experience, and that experience of really paying for your beliefs and fighting for them, but then knowing what it's like to actually find a path forward for the whole country, has been an animating one, and something that we, I think, as Canadians, and I personally draw real inspiration from. So thank you very much. I think your current job may be the very hardest one, to play a leading role at the UN at a time when multilateral institutions are facing some big challenges and questions is no easy thing. And to be fighting for human rights in the world today at a moment when, there is a a real pushback, as Michelle said, against human rights is also tough. And to do those two things at once is a truly formidable challenge. I'm looking forward to our conversation, but I'll just highlight one thing. We were thinking about ways to mark how much we respect Madame Bachelet, and to mark the specialness of her visit. And so we decided today to release Voices at Risk. These are guidelines that we have created inside the ministry for ways that our diplomats can work practically to support human rights defenders around the world. And Ben and other civil society actors in Canada were very much a part of putting this together. And it was really a response to the fact, I mean, a thing that has been really great and inspiring for me and my job is I think Canada's an amazing country, and I feel there is a real commitment in Canada and support by Canadians for human rights to be an important part of our foreign policy. And our diplomats are Canadian too. And so I have felt in our department, and you might want to speak to this, Ben, real enthusiasm among our diplomats for doing this work. But then you get the enthusiasm, you have the mission, and I think we're now at the stage of thinking practically, okay, this is something we want to do, this is something our country really believes in and stands for, how practically can we do it? And that's a task that we have tried to address in Voices at Risk. Okay?
Thank you very much. Just a hot pursuit on that one. I was not involved in the preparation of Voices at Risk. My very competent colleagues, ex-colleagues were, but it's going to be extremely important because even when you're very enthusiastic and it's clear with the instructions from Ottawa are to defend human rights, there are practical challenges that you face in an embassy. In our case in Venezuela, we give an annual Human Rights Award every year. And in one occasion, one of the previous awardees had his house broken into and he was beaten up. And it wasn't clear whether it was politically motivated or not. And the question for the embassy was, we were just about to go on a cross-country tour with this human rights defender, and he had just been subjected to this violent attack, and what should we do? And it was guidance like this that helped it make it clear for us that we should actually be redoubling our efforts to stand by these human rights defenders in the face of those kinds of difficult situations. So I salute the initiative. Let me start with a question about history. The High Commissioner referred to some of the early days of the formation of the International Human Rights Agenda right after the Second World War, the UN Charter, all the human rights treaties that now set the global norms that we try to live up to. Back then, there were only two superpowers, and both of them were in the global north. Since then, happily, there's been a diffusion of power through the system, and many people talk about the multipolarity. We're in a multipolar world. Some interpret multipolarity not just as the distribution of value or divergence the divergence of power, but also divergence in values. And I wonder in that context what you would say to those that say that perhaps this rules-based international order created 7 years ago is a relic of the past, and that perhaps, is it indeed still credible to talk about a single set of human rights standards that apply to all regions and all places?
Well, first of all, I believe that, as I mentioned before, that the human rights are universal, are indivisible, and we all need to, we cannot choose. I'm going to start with A, B, and I'm not going to do the other ones. As you listen in many discussions sometimes, I want to feed my people first, then I will give them freedom of expression. I don't believe you should do that. I mean, people are complete and integral person and need both things. They need to have food, health, education, and so on, but also the capacity and the possibility to discuss, to be able to disagree, and do it in a democratic and peaceful environment. So I do believe that we do need a multilateral system that is strong, that we can have a rule-based international order. We do need it. We might discuss in some minute if the international order, exactly how we did it in the past, it doesn't have any challenges that we need to look at it. Many people, for example, believe that there are areas and issues that are being discussed now in the human rights movement that were not there many years ago. So some people believe that we might need to review the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to think if we have to expand and include, for example, LGBTI rights, for example. I've been asked by LGBTI communities about that. But on the other hand, you can also say, look, it talks about all human beings independently or their diversity. Or some other people say, look, digital tools, maybe we need to include some other things. So I'm always open to discuss if there are things that maybe 70 years ago we just couldn't imagine, and we can maybe think on something else, but not to how could I say, not to restrict, but to expand, to improve, to be sure that we are fortifying, if I would say, the human rights mechanism, the civil society, and so on. So, because we are living in a paradox. Because today, the world, you see the digital tools, the global economy, everything is much more connected, but in the international community, we see much more fragmentation. So there is some things there we need to think, because I've asked myself, and I've been talking to the minister and the prime minister about this, because sometimes you look at the world today and see, okay, there is erosion. I mean, there are forces who don't believe in multilateralism, who want to produce other way of dealing countries bilaterally and so on. There are discussions on trade agreements, the discussion on a lot of things. So, and some president tells you, for example, look, I think the consensus that we were able to build is not a consensus anymore. We have to look at it again. So I've asked myself, and I don't have all the answers, is this a contingent issue or is it a structural issue? Because if it's contingent, you will think, I'm not going to mention anyone in particular, but maybe some administrations change and things will come back to as they were before. I don't know why I see some smiling faces over there, but it's only your fantasy. No. So the thing is that, unfortunately, I tend to believe it's more structural. It's not contingent. So I think we need to think, but I insist, not to restrict what we already have. It's to see if there are some things we're missing on how the world has evolved, and that we might not have seen. But it is going through a very difficult time. I mean, WTO negotiations can be a nightmare. I'm not a negotiator, fortunately. There's a lot of things going on there. But my impression is that there are some things and that specialists in foreign relationship need to think a little bit more on the solution to the current situation. But we do need human rights. We believe that what we have is good enough. It can be applied to different things, but still we're going into new issues because we believe we need to find solutions to problems that are challenging today.
Thank you. I'll ask the next question to Minister Freeland, if I might. Canada has been a vocal advocate of human rights for many, many years in both conservative and liberal governments. One of the particularities of the current government is that Prime Minister Trudeau has been quite forthright in acknowledging some of our failings in human rights as well. So, for example, that one chance that a Prime Minister has to address the whole world is the annual General Assembly speech. In 2017, he devoted a huge portion of it to apologizing for Canada's abuse of First Nations. I suppose my question would be, to what extent does that enhance our credibility when we are then talking about human rights in other countries? Or does it potentially undermine our credibility because it might sort of take some of the shine off Canada's reputation in human rights? What's your view on the effectiveness of acknowledging our own failings from time to time?
Well, I think that, and let me just say one thing about the High Commissioner's response, which is just to say, I agree with her 100%. And I think it actually always drives me completely crazy when I hear arguments made about how somehow it is culturally insensitive to stand up for the rights of women or of LGBTQ people, because I always think about that woman or that gay person or that lesbian. Like, do any of us feel we would be okay about saying to a woman in another country, oh, I have all of these rights, but actually you don't. And I think that it's okay for people to have the right to beat you or to not let you go to school. Like, do we feel that there is anything okay about that? I think nothing at all. And I think that it is actually the height of arrogance to act as if rights that I believe every Canadian has, somehow people, because they're not Canadian, are less of a person than a Canadian is. I feel that really, really strongly. To your question, Ben, I think that it makes, well, first of all, I think I am much less utilitarian than your question suggests. Not that you think I am utilitarian, but, you know, I think it's right for us to be honest and truthful, including about the motes in our own eyes, no matter what. Having said that, I think that it makes Canada a more credible defender of human rights around the world when we acknowledge very openly and not defensively that we still have a long way to go at home. I think that and I think that, you know, as the Prime Minister said at the UN, as Ben has just reminded us, there's a lot of work we have to do at home, and I think that that opens up a better, truer conversation with other countries. I have, though, heard, and I actually heard this most recently at the G7, where I was doing a press conference with Jeremy Hunt, and we were talking about our Media Freedom Conference that Canada is co-sponsoring in London next month. And one of the British journalists said, well, you know, now with all the problems of Brexit and so forth in the UK, is the UK even credible in speaking about rights around the world? And, you know, that is a challenge that you sometimes face. There was, Ben has referred to my own sort of initial experience in life, being a reporter first in the Soviet Union, then in the former Soviet Union. And this was actually one of the classic techniques of Soviet propaganda. It even had a name. It was called whataboutism. And so the idea was, whenever human rights in the Soviet Union were challenged, the Soviet response was to say, well, what about this problem in your own country? As if that disqualified the country from challenging the very flagrant abuses of human rights in the Soviet Union. And we have to really push back very, very strongly against that whole notion, against the idea that if we are not perfect, we have no right and no authority to fight for human rights around the world. I would say quite the contrary. I think that our own acknowledgement of the work we have to do at home and our own willingness to face up to that work and to keep going actually gives us much more credibility and authority in saying, you know, let's join arms with all the other people around the world, perhaps the young Michelles who in their own country are fighting to bring democracy and human rights to their countries.
Yes, please.
Well, I completely agree with Chrystia, because not only of all the reasons that you have mentioned that I agree on that, but also because if I am a country with problems, the only thing that I don't want is somebody in front of me to tell you, we are the good guys, you are the bad guys. When you acknowledge that you are not perfect, because there's no perfect society, I've tried to ask myself, is there any country where we could say there's no violation of human rights at all? And I don't think there's anyone, because either you have some minorities, you have some different kinds of problems. The Roma in Europe, the Fundamental Rights Agency of the European Union has discovered in some countries of Europe, Roma children have less access to school than in some African countries. So you have all this kind of situation. You have xenophobic speech, hate speech, so many things. So I think it's also the best way to deal with other people, not to lecture them, but to tell them, look, this is what I believe. I have problems as well as you have, and how we have, but we are acknowledging, we are dealing with them, we're confronting them. You can also do that. So I truly believe that's the right way.
Thank you. While we're on the topic of speaking up on human rights issues, I'd like to talk about private and public conversations. as voices in defense of human rights have dimmed somewhat, and some of the traditional champions of human rights have, their voices are not heard as prominently as they might used to be. The voices of those that continue to speak, like Canada, have become more noticed and more prominent, and sometimes more heavily reacted against. So, Minister, obviously you made a statement in favor of human rights, of women's rights in Saudi Arabia, which, you know, why wouldn't you? But it obviously had quite a strong reaction, and some are worried about the cost that is borne, either on the subjects of the advocacy or on other issues. I'd like to ask, based on your own experience and your observations, when is it useful to keep advocacy private, and when is it useful to bring the public in to what Canada thinks on human rights issues? Let me start with the Minister, and then I'll return to the High Commissioner.
So I think that's a great question, Ben, and as a diplomat, I know that it's something that you grappled with also. And I think the answer is we have to do both. I would say to you, especially the students who are here, be careful to hold our feet to the fire, that is the feet of the politicians, because I do think that it can be sometimes a convenient story to tell, to say, well, we raise these issues in our private conversations. It's much more effective that way. I'm not saying those conversations aren't important and effective, but sometimes you do have to speak out in public. And you know, a thing that I listen to a lot is what people who are being oppressed say. And those voices to me and those sources of advice to me are very, very important. And if people who are being hurt, people who are being tortured, and there are people being tortured in the world right now, if they say, please raise our cases publicly, then I think that is a moral imperative we have to listen to very, very carefully. And I think, you know, I'll give you guys one example. I was, just a few days ago, I had a phone conversation with the foreign minister of Mali. And I think he won't mind my saying this publicly. But he said to me at the end of the conversation, he said, and I just want you to know that I have a special affection for Canada. Because when I was a prisoner in the desert in Mali, and he said, those were very, very hard conditions. And just hearing him say it, I just sort of could imagine how atrocious that could have been. So there was an Amnesty International group in Montreal that took up my case, and they wrote me letters. And I will never forget those people and the comfort and support they gave me. And now he's the foreign minister. So, you know, I think it's always important to think about those people and the ways we can give them comfort and succor and support, and let them know, you know, as we said at the beginning of this conversation, universal values really are universal, and someone being tortured in a prison somewhere has as many rights as every single one of us in this room. Now, having said that, in addition to encouraging people and, you know, giving them good heart, we want to achieve positive, practical results. That is very, very important. And you're quite right, Ben, that working together with like-minded countries, we can be more effective than when we speak alone. Sometimes you have to speak alone, but it's great when you can speak together. And so, you know, I'll give you a few examples of how that can actually work. Something that Canada has just finished co-chairing with Chile is the Equal Rights Coalition. This is a fantastic group, and it is a group of countries who have come together around a shared belief in LGBTQ2 rights, and we agree to work together to champion these around the world. There are co-chairs who have a co-chair countryship for 2 years. Canada and Chile are just finishing, and we're handing over to the UK and Argentina. That is a great example of a way to work going forward. It doesn't always have to be a big group. when it comes to Hong Kong, Canada has a particular responsibility because of the 300,000 Canadians living in Hong Kong. The UK also has a clear particular responsibility, and so in our first statement around Hong Kong, we chose to issue a statement together with the UK. And that's another example of working together. This Media Freedom Conference that will happen next month also kind of grew out of conversations that Jeremy Hunt and I were having, where it started with exactly your point, Ben. And we agreed that we would be more effective when it came to defending the rights of journalists around the world if we could bring together a coalition of countries who agreed in advance that we would speak out together about journalists who were under threat. And so that really is the sort of key idea behind holding this conference, and something that, you know, we're going to work together to do.
I wonder if I might put the same question to the High Commissioner. The High Commissioner for Human Rights is one of the most senior and high-profile and therefore difficult jobs in the UN system. The judgment calls must be very difficult, and different High Commissioners for Human Rights have taken different approaches to this line between public and private. I wonder if you could explain what philosophy you bring to that judgment.
Well, first of all, as Chrystia mentioned, there's no one-size-fits-all answer, and it depends also on which role do you play? Are you in government? Are you in the UN? Are you in a humanitarian agency? Because if you're in a humanitarian agency, probably you're not the one to have to speak up because you need access to the ground. So it will depend a lot on which your role is in each of them. And I'm going to go to your answer, but I wanted to say that because in the past when I was at UN Women, we used to discuss a lot with Tony Lakes of UNICEF. Should UNICEF speak about the violation of children's rights? But if we do it, we might get kicked out of the country, and we want to support the country, he will tell me. So I will think that it depends on what you expect to do in a place. And this is a particularly very important issue because, you know, we are going through a development reform, and now the resident coordinators are like the representative Secretary General in the country. It's not only the UNDP, the development area. So some resident coordinators that have asked themselves, should I speak of human rights? Should I not speak? What if I am, I don't know if you know the word, because I learned it in the UN, what if I'm PMG? That's the first time I listened to her. I said, what does Papua New Guinea has to do with this? Well, PNG is to be considered a persona non grata, no? So to be expelled from the country. So there is, it's a tension, I believe, that many people will have in the future to see which is our role. And I'm going to go to my particular role, but I mean, it's not only my issues. In the different levels, you have to decide in each minute, in case to case, if I would say, because it's completely different. For example, sometimes to speak out means to save somebody's life, and that is fundamental, because you say that person has been detained, we demand to be released immediately, etc., all the media and everybody focus there, you save the people's life. So then you cannot be silent. Some other times it helped us a lot also as well. In Guatemala and El Salvador, they were passing bills that if they were approved, next day all people who were convicted by genocide will be released. And we make some public statement, and they did not vote in parliament, and they stopped. And we are really alert because this can happen again. In many other parts we have seen the same. So, or for example, sometimes whatever you're going to say, it might not mean a real difference, but people on the ground, human rights defenders, women rights defenders, land rights, environmental defenders, indigenous human rights defenders, they will feel that they're not alone. So many times to speak out is so important. But on the other hand, sometimes you can identify you need to do the other thing as well, because you need to engage with government in a private public conversation, because you talk with the government, but also you go to talk to the media. So it's not that you have to choose A or B. And what I try to bring to this position is my experiences, because I was a victim of human rights violation. I was in dictatorship. I worked in an NGO during dictatorship, and then I was in office in a government. And I try to bring all that experience when I'm dealing with an issue, depending on the issue. I mean, I'm not gonna go and discuss privately on the Rohingyas issue in Myanmar, because what happens so awful, you only have to do what you have to do. So I will tell you, but I tried to bring in not in so horrible conditions, in situations that there are violations of human rights, but that are different kind of situations, that you can also engage with governments, try to convince them to do that. Because also what happens in some countries, particularly the more fragile states, is that sometimes they don't have the national capacity. The judiciary system is not strong enough. The police forces and the armed forces are not, that don't have the adequate training. So it's not that you have to choose A or Z. You can use all the strategies needed to have positive outcomes. And I am flexible. I can be the bad person. I mean, because if I'm PNG, what? I mean, it's not a problem for me. But on the other hand, we do need access, because we want our officers to be there, working on the field every day, supporting civil society, supporting human rights defenders, working with government. So you need to decide, but there's no one single recipe. You have to find according case to case. But every time it's needed to talk, we'll speak, we're going to speak.
Minister?
Yeah, no, I just want to kind of echo what Michelle has said. The world is complicated, and so in each situation we have to make some very careful and thoughtful judgments, always having in mind that we want to, advance the cause of human rights around the world. The one thing that I think maybe was also implicit in your question, and certainly that I sometimes hear and read, that I'd like to push back against, is there can sometimes be a point of view which suggests that somehow the practical, the pragmatic thing is not to speak out in support of human rights. And somehow that speaking out in support of human rights is, there are young students here, so, it's a juvenile thing, it's a thing you care about in your student years, but, as you become an older, serious person, you realize that it's, maybe a frivolous thing, or something that, you can't do in once you are vested in making sort of serious, responsible judgments. And, as Michelle has said, you have to make, when you're speaking for a country, you have to make very, careful decisions around what to say and when to say it and how to say it. But I also always or often think about something really wise that a person I respect very, very much, Andrei Sakharov, said. And he, of course, took all of his prestige as a great physicist and put it behind the cause of human rights in the Soviet Union. And one thing that he said was that, he sometimes heard this argument that to speak out for human rights by other countries would somehow hurt their national interest and you shouldn't do it, and that it wasn't a practical or pragmatic thing. And what he said, I think, is profoundly true, which is, at the end of the day, speaking out for human rights, having policies, having a politics, an approach to your own politics at home, an approach to how you are as a country in the world, where human rights are central, is the most practical thing in the world. Because at the end of the day, that is how you want to be perceived, that is how you want other actors to perceive you. And at the end of the day, if you are a country where human rights are important, and Canada certainly is that, we benefit. We do better in a world where there are strong human rights protections for everyone. That is a world that is much more positive for us. So, I am an idealist, but I also really want us to bear so strongly in mind the practical value of advancing this agenda.
Thank you. Let me move on to some of the new issues that the High Commissioner mentioned earlier. Now, in a rapidly changing world with new technology and changing societal norms, there are new opportunities to advance human rights, and there are also new threats to human rights. You've talked about what you call frontier issues of human rights, which I'd like to hear more about. And I suppose the challenge question I'd like to put to you is that many would argue we're not doing as well as we should on the existing agenda. And so as we expand that agenda, is there some risk that we might be diluting the energy we have to make progress on the longstanding problems?
Well, I think the worst thing is not to identify the threats for human rights. So it's not diluting, it's identifying new threats that maybe were not clear, they were not present before because we didn't have the advance in technology, for example, that we have now. So for the office, we'll continue working strongly on political and civil rights, of course. We also continue working, we have been doing in the past as well, on economic, social, and cultural rights, but on our area, on advocacy, on which is our added value, for example, for the 2030 Agenda of Sustainable Development. We're not an implementing agency, we're not going to be UNDP, UNICEF, or whatever, but we do understand, and not everyone understands, for example, that climate change, it puts a big threat on human rights. And we need to make advocacy so also to convince government to do the right thing on that, because it's already having a lot of an impact on many countries. There's the B20, the 20 most vulnerable countries for climate change. So we participate with finance ministers in workshops saying, look, you have to do this and this and that. And even though finance minister, but they start understanding, for example, that the cost of inaction can be much bigger than the cost of action. So I try to bring them to the discussion, look, you're not doing anything because you say you don't have money, but look, if you don't do anything, this is what's going to happen to you, to your population, even for your budget. So we're trying to bring the added value, not to replace others who are going to continue doing whatever. So we are continuing working for gender issues. Of course, we are not UN women, but I cannot help it. And children's rights, of course, I'm a pediatrician, so for me it's always very important, and young people as well, because it's on advocacy, it's on creating synergies with other colleagues in other agencies to push together to a common agenda and to try to have bigger results and try to convince governments to do the right thing on these different areas. In particular, the digital and technological area, it's an area that my predecessor started, and I have taken it also with passion, because we believe there is very sensitive. Everybody's speaking about the 4.0 industrial revolution, like the artificial intelligence, like the solution for all the problems of the world. But what have been seen? First of all, that yes, theoretically and probably it will mean huge expansion on possibilities on democracy, on medicine, on many aspects that you can solve through new algorithms, new platforms, new areas. But on the other hand, we have seen now, it's not theoretical, the misuse of these tools. For example, in the social media was a very important issue triggering violence against the Rohingyas in Myanmar. Right. The hate speech. And so that was something that happened already. And we know that we have seen a lot of hate speech through social media. So that's one area where the UN is discussing about what else should we do about it. The other thing is facial recognition, for example, has been used in a way to repress people. Online and all kinds of different social media has been used to detect human rights defenders, arrest them, even kill them. So we are not talking fantasy. We're talking about how digital tools that can be so good can be so bad as well, because it's not a problem of technology, it's people who use it with certain objectives. So we are working with with companies to see how we can ensure that digital tools and technology can expand human rights and not being misused for other reasons. But on the other hand, it's very tricky, it's very complicated, because how you, for example, do everything to avoid hate speech and maintain freedom of expression, freedom of participation, there are ways of doing it. My impression, because I was in Silicon Valley two months ago and discussed with many companies, that the tech companies, they understand they have problems. I don't know if all of them really understand the problem, but at least they know they have reputational risk if they don't deal with this thing, so they're interested. But the problem right now is that the companies are doing it each by their own through the ethics office. And ethics is a concept that can change from one country to another, from one company to another. So we're looking forward to try to build, and the UN wants to be a convening place to bring a lot of stakeholders together, governments, private sector, academia, technical people, developers, etc., to try to think because today what we're trying to do is to produce the remedy for the problems. But we should have a human rights approach from the design, from the first moment that we designed this. And let me give you an example. There was one very big, important company who had a recruitment algorithm. And suddenly they discovered that it was gender bias. So all women were, left behind. And another Afro-American female researcher found out that other platforms were biased with Afro descent. And this is a clear explanation, I guess. It's that the majority of the developers, the youth, the people who were there, at least in the Silicon Valley, the majority are male, white. Very few Latin Americans, they were 4%, but when you think of percent, the real developers, 2%. Afro-descendant, 2%, but the real ones, 1%. I mean, the other ones were people who are doing other kind of jobs. So we have a problem because we don't have the representation of the whole world in this very important area. And I'm looking forward tomorrow in the afternoon to have meetings with the tech companies here in Canada as well, to look and invite them to work on this, to see how we can improve technology to produce, how there was this young guy from one of these very big companies, very sort of young scientific guy said, tech for good, tech for good. Yeah, that's what we want, tech for good, and try to avoid all the violation of human rights. But we do have problems right now with the misuse of technology. And we need to, so it's not that we want to dilute, because again, it's targeting the same kind of people. It's targeting human rights defenders, it's targeting journalists, so it's part of our job. But we're not going to dilute, huh? We would like to be bigger, to be able to, we have very small amount of people working on this, but we're very enthusiastic about it.
Well, I appreciate that. I can tell you as someone who's launched a software company, there's a lot more money for tech for profit than there is for tech for good. So I welcome the profile the United Nations is bringing to that. I might ask a question on freedom of expression. As a former foreign correspondent, I know that you, Minister, respect the role that the journalists have in informing citizens so they can protect their own rights. And yet we're hearing this famous old line that authoritarian leaders have used for years to describe the media as the enemy of the people. Now, an increasing number of governments are taking that quite literally, and there's been a dramatic increase in the deaths of journalists. We think most prominently recently of Jamal Khashoggi, murdered by his own government in Saudi Arabia. We were talking earlier about Amnesty International. It occurred to me that in a previous era, the international community focused particular attention on one category of human rights actor, of prisoners of conscience. And there was a determined effort in the 60s and 70s by Amnesty International and others to shine particular light on that particular set of problems and to constrain the abilities of authoritarian governments. I wonder, has the time come for the international community to shine that special attention on protecting journalists abroad?
Yes, and at home, and that's why we're doing this conference next month. As having been a journalist, now being a politician, I appreciate the importance of a free and independent media as an essential part of a healthy democracy more than ever. Now, that doesn't mean that I respond in my heart with joy to every single question I am asked. One of my cabinet colleagues, one of my most senior and wise and experienced cabinet colleagues likes to say to us, each one of us around this table is just one press conference away from having to resign. And I think about that before doing every single interview. So it's hard. It's harder to be a politician in a country with a free and independent media. But we collectively all do a better job where we have a free and independent media. And I totally agree with you, Ben. that now is a moment when, first of all, we politicians have to really support the right of our own journalists in our own countries to ask questions, even when they're questions that make us uncomfortable, and often the best questions do. That's really, really important. And we have to be really aware of the extent to which journalists around the world are being specifically targeted. And, that is really the core concern that has motivated this International Media Freedom Conference. Coming back to the beginning of our conversation, one of the things that Jeremy Hunt and I really believe is that, there is a large group of countries around the world where there is a kind of general view that media freedom is important. And what we're hoping to do with this conference, one of the things we're hoping to do with this conference, is take that general sentiment and sort of channel it into some specific collective action that we can take to expand or to expand and to maintain the space for free media in the world. I think that that's really, really important. And I think that that is something that, it's not going to be achievable in every single case. But, where we come together, and, we were delighted that the two Reuters journalists in Myanmar were released. Ivan Golunov in Russia. I mean, there are some positive stories as well, where when journalists act together in defending one of their own, where when countries together speak out, we can achieve real victories.
Yes.
May I add something? Yeah, well, I agree completely, but there's two things that came to my mind. First of all, that in the UN, we already have that task. I mean, it's task for UNESCO and for the Office of the High Commission of Human Rights to be following the situation of journalists, to work with governments to have some protective measures. For example, in Mexico, there is it's called, I don't remember the exact name, but there is a Commission of Protection of Journalists and something like that. Of course, it not always works, and they give them protection, they give them, personal protection, and so on. So it's not that nothing's been done, but we need to do much more, and we need to bring more attention, because probably Jamal Khashoggi's case was very well known because of the conditions that everything happened. But all over the world, every day, journalists are being killed and they're being harassed. So that's one thing we are working on it, and also with the Office of the Secretary General. But on the other hand, I was thinking, yes, we need freedom of expression, but as the Minister said, it has to be independent media, because in many countries, even European countries, we have seen a tendency to over-concentrate, media in hands or political power or economic power, and that's also not very good for democracy. You need to ensure that all the perspectives are there. So freedom of expression is really freedom of expression, and not the so-called freedom of expression to put only one view and one perspective. And we have seen that, unfortunately, in many parts of the world, that there has been a shrinking of the civic space. We've also been seeing the tendency of some governments to buy media and to control media at the end. So it doesn't give the possibility of freedom complete of information that the citizens deserve to make the best choices. So that's the thing. And the other thing is that during election time, usually you see much more, difficulties in this regard. But we are following that as well. We have the special rapporteurs that are very active on all these issues.
Excellent. I'll ask one final question, but especially in view of our audience, we have two prominent leaders in the global fight for human rights, but we also have students and civil society organizations, the shock troops for that same fight. And I wonder if you have one area of hope that you'd like to point to. There's been a lot of threats, but there's also real innovation. There's new tools and new instruments in the multilateral system to advance human rights. Is there one that each of you would like to focus on? What gives you hope when you look at the future of the global fight for human rights? I'll start with Minister Freeland, then I'll end with you, our guest.
Yeah, I'm very glad to end on a note of hope because I think we can be too gloomy, and gloom is not necessarily a good goad to action. So, I was reflecting as we were speaking, Ben, on where we started, which was the Universal Declaration. Thank you for mentioning John Humphrey's very important Canadian contribution. And we sort of, that is a very important moment, but let's also not romanticize it, right? This was just at the beginning of the Cold War. The Soviet Union was really, at that point, just really getting down to some serious repression, notwithstanding its participation in the Universal Declaration. So, I think that the moment today is serious, and we need to act in a serious way, but let's not act as if there haven't been difficult challenges in the past, and as if those, we've overcome a lot of those challenges. So, my hopeful thought, particularly for the Canadian students here, is I would say start with the understanding that all of you, and I am much older than you, but I include myself in the statement, all of us stand on the shoulders of giants. We're very lucky to have inherited so much great work by great Canadians and many others. I think that there has never been a better time to be a young person in Canada than today. And I'm not saying your life is perfect, but I think, whether you are a man or a woman, whether you are LGBTQ or not, your rights and opportunities and abilities to sort of act in the world have never been greater. And that is fantastic. That doesn't mean it's perfect, a lot of work to do, as we discussed with Ben, but take that as your starting point. And then I would say, I really feel that you as young people have a real opportunity to, standing on those shoulders of giants, to look ahead and to say, what is the next kind of, what should the new normal be? What should the new normal be of everyone having real rights, real freedoms, real opportunities to realize themselves in Canada and around the world? And I fully expect, my eldest daughter is graduating from high school on Friday, so I'm thinking a lot about young people and how great you are. And I fully expect that the young people here, you guys are going to take Canada and the world to the next level. Hanging out with you, and I do hang out with a lot of teenagers because I have a couple in my house and they have friends. You give me so much hope and optimism, and I really feel if we, the older people, if we can just kind of keep things going until you guys are old enough to take over, I feel, at least speaking for Canada, that we will be in great shape.
And final word to you, High Commissioner, what gives you hope?
Well, first of all, I think, if sometimes you can sound gloomy, is because I always receive the bad news. That's what, somebody tells me, are you enjoying the job? And I say, well, enjoy is not exactly the word that comes to my mind, really. But the thing is that I agree on youth possibilities. And of course, Canada is a country that for many of us, it's a fantastic example. I mean, when you live in a country, usually you see the problems because you are so used to the good things that you see what you need to go further. And that's normal, that's progress, and that's okay. But it's a country with fantastic for so many of us. But on the other hand, if you think on Greta Thunberg, these Swedish young children, 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds, even alone at the beginning, going in the street about climate change and calling adults, not only government, adults, to take action, to stop talking and take action. And you see then in Switzerland, every Friday, the students will march and demonstrate for asking people to make action. So I think youth can be a very important, if I can send a message, is every one of you can change the history. And if you work together, being active, you can make history and change the history. So this is not something that our destiny is to be in a terrible situation. The second thing is civil society. Civil society, you have real champions, people there sometimes very alone, with little help, and everything that Canada can do to support them is very important as well, because they do fantastic things. Sometimes small, local, but really important in terms of what they can produce as an impact. And the third thing is that because I'm always looking at the bad news, I'm trying to find good stories. And there are also good stories. Not perfect stories, but good stories. And I'm going to mention a couple of countries that I think they're doing, or 3 countries that are doing pretty good. One is Ethiopia, a new government. They sort of released political prisoners. It's not perfect, I insist. Political prisoners. They had a paritarian cabinet for the first time, half women, half men, first female president, and a lot of bills that are advancing democracy. So it's a good story. Maybe it's a beginning, but it's a good story. Tunis, I just went to Tunisia, and again, not in every area probably, and civil society can be very critical on a lot of things. They still have to go more through transitional justice, but still, on gender issues, they have advanced a lot. And it's very interesting because it's a Muslim country, an Arab country, and they have done a lot. So it can be a very good region, example for the MENA region as well. The Maldives, they changed government from autocratic to a democratic government. They immediately asked the Secretary General, tell the High Commission to send us human rights advice because we need to improve the law. So other things happen. There are more, but I just mentioned 3 of them. So there are countries who are trying to do the best they can to try to end with the bad past and construct a new future. And so, but I mainly believe that if we all work together, we will have better chances. Also, first of all, because challenges are common. They're not isolated. So we all work together. And looking at young people here, it's hopeful that they really get motivated and enthusiastic about this human rights movement and all the different issues, because we really need you, and you can make history. Thank you.
Minister?
I want to tell one very tiny, small, practical story. So we're talking about these very big, lofty things, John Humphrey's Universal Declaration, countries releasing political prisoners, big changes. And that is all excellent Indigenous rights, really big, difficult issues, and that is very important, and we need to keep working at it. One of the things that I really value from when I talk to young people, whether they are my own children or young Canadians, is because you are young, things that we older people have been deadened to, we think it's just the way it is. You can see them in a fresh way and say, this is stupid, why do we do it this way? And I'm going to give you a really practical example I was thinking about as Michelle was talking. So last September, together with Federica Mogherini of the EU, we hosted in Montreal what we think is the first kind of working meeting of the women foreign ministers of the world. And before that meeting, I went and had a meeting with some high school students at the Rosedale School of the Arts in my riding. And before the meeting, we had said to them, my team said to them, so, we would like to hear your ideas for what this group of women ministers should be working at. And one of the ideas I would never in a million years have thought of, they gave me these 10 recommendations, and one was from the young women in the high school. They said, you know what? It drives us crazy that tampons are not available in the bathrooms of our high school. Toilet paper is available, tampons are not. It restricts our lives. It makes it really hard. And I had just, that's the world I grew up in. But you know what? They had an excellent point, and I took it very seriously. I went back to my ministry, and I said, we need to ensure that tampons are available for free in all of our, I thought, okay, in the part that I'm responsible for, let's just do this. And my new deputy minister, who is a woman, recently told me that in the Canadian offices, we have now achieved this level of consciousness. So that's like a very small example. It is not at the level of political prisoners. But you know what? Even things in your life that you see that are not the way they should be, tell us. And maybe we'll have that moment of epiphany and say, yeah, you're totally right, and let's just change it.
Thank you so much for coming here to Canada. Thank you to both of you for your leadership on human rights. Thank you to your call for all of us, and particularly for you, to stand on those shoulders of giants, as the Minister has said, and to imagine a better world and to work for it. It's been an inspiring afternoon. It's been an honor to be with you today. Thank you.
Thank you.